Hi, my name is Bill Lokey, and I've been a therapist for a little over 23 years, as well as a clinical director out at Onsite. I served for about 10 years. So I've done this work for a long time. I've been helping people who are in crisis or having real difficult times in their lives. And one thing that I see over and over again are people that are really surprised that they're having a problem. They're really surprised that something has either imploded or exploded in their life. Oftentimes, they're people that have faith in God, that have really trusted in God, and they don't really believe necessarily that God let them down, although that is where some people believe. But it's just that they're surprised that they thought that as long as they had a strong faith, that things would work out well for them. And yet still, for some of them, their child died from an overdose of drugs, or their marriage blew apart and they wound up getting divorced, or they wound up having a terrible accident and they were disabled for the rest of their lives. Other kinds of incidents that have occurred that have torn apart their lives. Maybe they went bankrupt. But oftentimes a person will come and they say, I'm really surprised because I thought things were working out in my life okay. I thought that as long as I trusted in God and I had a strong faith or I had a good community, that things would be going okay. And I guess I want to talk just a little bit about what I've seen and how I've seen people get help. I also have a strong faith in God as well. I'm a Christian. I believe very strongly in my relationship with Jesus. And yet I've also seen that there have been times in my life when things have fallen apart. Things didn't go well. And then to watch the recovery from that and how recovery took place. And I've seen over the years as I've worked with people that it's not just a matter of if I just keep acting like things are going okay, even when it's not, it'll finally turn out okay, because sometimes it doesn't. And so I want to just bring some honesty to this for a moment. If you've really been going through a period of pain in your life, or something's going on and you're not really sure you understand why you feel the way you feel, it's not just a matter of, let's just pretend like it's not. If you go to church on Sunday morning and say, things are great and I'm really trusting God and things are going to turn out okay. Because you see, God is not one who's always been willing to take the pain out of our lives just so that we can kind of then prove to other people that our faith in Him was the thing that fixed us. That's not the way God's worked all throughout the scriptures or throughout our lives. Instead, God has used pain and struggle as a way to bring us closer to Him, as a way to actually realize that we need help and that we don't just do this all by ourselves. One of the things I do know is that when we just turn inside and say, I'm not sharing this with anybody, I'm not going to let anybody know I've got a struggle, that's the environment that actually creates shame to grow even more. Because when I get silent and I don't tell anybody else what's going on in my life, or I begin to compare myself to other people, what I also know is that that's the environment where shame grows. And I actually think that I'm not going to be able to share with anyone else. And so I become even more alone and more lonely in comparing myself with others. What we often do actually is we compare our insides with other people's outsides. And when we do that, we always wind up losing. So therapy, as some of you that are looking at this may think that it's kind of an evil or it's something that's unnecessary, or if we really believed in God enough that we shouldn't need therapy. Well, here is sitting at least in front of you is a therapist who also is a very strong Christian, and I have a very strong faith. But one of the things I know is it helped very much for me to be able to take a look at what was going on inside. What was behind the things that was driving some of my behavior that wasn't actually a good behavior. And so that's the place where I think we can really get some good is we sit down with another person, especially someone that has some life experience, or as a therapist who's maybe been trained in looking at what is it that maybe has been driving my behavior that doesn't have to do with unbelief. Because, in my life, I found myself really struggling with depression, struggling with even wanting to be loved by other people so that I would feel okay about myself, and seeking that even when it started to create damage in my life. And I couldn't seem to stop seeking the approval and love of other people. And that wound up creating a big fall in my life. And wondering, is there something wrong with me? What I didn't understand at the time was there was a pain and a hurt that I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. But from way back, I also knew that there was a shame that I carried inside of me. That if you really get to know me and really understand me, you're not going to accept me. And so I began to have to put on the layers of what I looked like on the outside. What a good therapist does is doesn't just tell you how to do things better or give you good advice. What a really good therapist is about is really helping you look to find out, where is some of this stuff being driven from? Where is the pain that maybe drives the behavior that is something I don't really want in my life anymore? And then when I begin to see it and I begin to understand where it's coming from, then oftentimes I can really begin to go, I don't want to do that anymore. But that still doesn't solve the problem, because we know a lot of things that we wish we didn't do. But when I can begin to understand that there is hurt that's been in there that drives me to do something or to react to people when I feel hurt again in a similar way, then I begin to realize I need to do some healing around some of that hurt. Some of those wounds. One thing that's a really good test sometimes is notice your daydreams. Not just your dreams at night, but the things you daydream about during the day. When you're driving down the road, when you're cutting the grass, those places we think. And when you begin to catch yourself going to those places over and over again that we think about, sometimes those will give you some really good indications of where some of our hurts were. For me, I will tell you, it's almost embarrassing to tell, but one of the things I would catch myself in over and over again is I would begin to feel this sense of, I'm telling somebody about that I was angry with them and almost telling them off. And I'd have imagined friends standing with me going, yeah, Bill, you tell them. And I would begin to feel this anger. And I was like, what is this anger about? Because I couldn't maybe sometimes even find a situation that prompted that. And I began to realize there was a sense of hurt. And out of that hurt had grown a sense of resentment and feeling like that maybe I wasn't being respected as much as I wished I had been because of some of that earlier hurt. But what therapy did for me was it helped me to begin to see the hurt, where some of this came out of. And as I began to find the hurt, I began to realize that there was also still this kid inside of me that was trying to not feel the hurt. And when I began to not want to feel that anymore, I began to find I would do other things to try to not feel it, but I was still carrying it. And it would come out sometimes as resentment, or sometimes come out as trying to look good, but I didn't want people to know who I really was. However, isn't it interesting that when you and I really sit down and know who we are, that's when we're drawn the closest. I don't know if you've ever been into a small group of people, but you begin to share stories and share things about yourself that you go, this is a hard one to share, but I've struggled with this. That's where you and I actually relate to one another. If we sit around and talk about all of our awards and all of the things we've done right, we really don't feel very much closer to each other. It's when we actually share our struggles, we share our vulnerabilities, that's when we begin to be drawn to trust each other. There's something almost nothing more trustworthy than if I share something about my story that's scary and someone else looks at me and says, you know what? Me too. I've had a similar experience. I've done some of those similar things that I wasn't proud of, but here's maybe how I began to find some healing, or here's some ways I've done some things differently. And then we begin to share and build each other up. It's helpful for me to understand why I react the way I do. There's this wonderful story in the Bible, in the Old Testament, actually in the book of Numbers, one we don't always go to with stories. But in chapter 14, there's this great story about where God wanted his people to move into this land that is where the statement comes from, we say, flowing with milk and honey. It was a very productive land. It had great stuff growing there. And God wanted his people to move into and to get to enjoy that. But there were some others that they had heard rumors about, some big people that were good warriors, knew how to do battle. And basically in the story, what we can use that as a description now is these were people that they were terrified of. Sometimes you and I get really terrified of things in our life that we don't understand. We get terrified about wounds or about things that we've been afraid of in the past that have overcome us or overtaken us. And when we get scared, we don't want to go back there. We don't want to go back and think about that or hurt that way anymore. And so we want to avoid it any way we can. And in this story, they sent out 12 people to be spies to kind of look around the land and see what was there. And they came back, and 10 of those people that kind of spied out the land said, yeah, there's some wonderful stuff there, but there is no way we can kind of go in there and take this on as our land. And there's some huge folks there that we're afraid might make war with us. We might infringe on their boundaries or whatever it is, and we can't do this. But there were 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, who said, wait a minute. It doesn't matter what we're seeing. God said, go. God said, do this. God said, I'm going to bless you. And you know, I think one of the things that was most egregious in this situation was not that 10 of them said, no, we're scared. We don't want to do this. What they said was, we want to go back to Egypt where we were enslaved. We'd rather go back to a place where, no, we don't like it. We don't want to go back to being slaves. We were terribly treated, but would rather do what we're familiar with than to step into the unfamiliar, because that's scary. And we don't trust God enough to do that. I think that's one of the biggest fears for most of us, is not so much that we know we want to maybe get something different from what we've had in the past, but sometimes what we've known, even though it's not good, is less frightening than the unknown. And that's where I think we hurt ourselves some of the times, is we'd rather just go back to what's familiar, even though it's not going to give me what I really long for, than to move ahead, sometimes through the pain, through the fears, to find what it is that God really has for us. That's the place where I think most of us wind up missing out on what God has for us. What I want to invite us into is that sometimes it's walking into and through the pain to find out what's been driving my behaviors that keep me from stepping into the promises of God, that keep me from stepping into saying I'm sorry to my spouse, that keep me from moving into something that I know I might be really able to do that and gifted to do that, but I'm too afraid to do. Instead, I think I want to invite us to maybe stepping into understanding what's been driving where I'm coming from. And some of that has been pain. The gift of therapy is one of those places that's about saying, let's look at where you came from so that we can understand what it is you're doing so that you can make a different future for yourself, one that's really good. But sometimes when we're not willing to look back at where we came from and what's driving some of the things, we wind up missing out on a great future. It's not about not trusting God, because I really trust God. I think a part of it is that we do trust God to say, I'm willing to look at where I came from so that, God, I can understand where it is that I'm not agreeing with you on how you want to give me my life that you're calling me into, the life that you want me to walk towards, the person that you made me to be. What I ask is that right now we just say, what's the next step in moving towards God's calling on our lives? And maybe, just maybe, that's looking back a little bit so that we can begin to move forward. Thanks, and I hope this may be helpful in some way.